Hello, everyone. This is lecture 2A about globalization and globalism. So let's share the screen and go over to the PowerPoint. Okay, so globalization and globalism. So here we have a photo of the globe as we tend to imagine it. We can imagine it turning, we can imagine it from this perspective from outer space. Of course, for most of human history, we have not had this kind of view. When I say we, I mean all human beings. This is something that is the result of very recent experiences, like sending satellites up into the atmosphere and then sending human beings up into the atmosphere and beyond to the moon. So this is not something that people even 100 years ago would have been as familiar with. It would be something that is linked with the development of globalization in recent decades. So before we talk about globalization, let's go back and think about how we represent the world. Okay, what does it mean to think about the world? How do we map it? Well, one of the very first things that we see in mapping is the need to locate oneself. Where am I, not only in relationship to, say, a hill that I can see behind my house. Right now I can look back and I can see Mount Ribadeau from my office window in downtown Riverside. How is it that I can then locate that mountain, myself, and perhaps the campus, besides just looking up at the sun? What if it's raining? What if it's dark? How can I do that? Well, I need a compass. The compass was invented over 2,000 years ago in China, and the very first ones were made of lodestone, which is a naturally magnetized stone of iron. So you can see this is from the Han Dynasty from 200 AD. Having this navigating device allows us to locate ourselves, to chart our course, say, against, across a sea or across a landmass, and it sets the basis for all other maps of the world and indeed our conception of modern space. By the early years of the current era, we see the development of some new ways of representing the world and adding to the sort of north, south, east, west coordinates. Ptolemy's map, which was based on the book that he wrote called Geography, and that was written in the year 150. This map uses not only those four spatial coordinates, but adds longitudinal and latitudinal lines to, again, further situate locations on the map. Okay, so for instance, here you can see, the tip of Morocco here, Tangiers. You can go, you can see basically the outline of contemporary Europe. We can recognize Italy, Greece, Turkey, the Black Sea. I mean, all of this is very recognizable to us even today, even though there are obviously some, we wouldn't think of it as absolutely precise, but nonetheless, we can still see the rivers, we can see the mountains. It's definitely a map that we would recognize. This map, on the other hand, by Idrisi in 1154, which covers some of the same regions, we might not immediately see. Okay, so this is Idrisi's map over here and how it ought to be looked at. And here, on the other side of this arrow, we see what it might look like if we turned it around, if it's flipped. Okay, so Idrisi was originally from Morocco. He worked in Sicily, and so he knew the Mediterranean area very well as a geographer. But why is it that his map is flipped? Okay, this gets into some of the questions about culture and representations of the world. Well, just as in Arabic one writes not from left to right as in the Latin script, but from right to left, he was considering his center of the world was Mecca right here, and his way of looking at the world is revealed in the way that the map is centered. Here's the North Pole here at the bottom, and here we have it in the way that the Western maps and indeed world maps all over now situated at the top. Others who developed maps were, for instance, Honji Gamji Yekde Guti Jido. I'm sorry for anyone who speaks Korean, I do not. This is my poor attempt to pronounce the correct title of the Map of the Integrated Lands and Regions of Historical Countries and Capitals by Yi Ho and Kwon Kun in 1402. So you can clearly see Korea Peninsula here with various rivers, cities, seas. Again, this is a project that's taking people into it from all over the world, Asia, Europe, the Middle East. Map makers all over the world are contributing to creating this broader world map, sometimes from these individual maps of particular places. And then with regard to the world as a whole. This is Ribero's world map, 1529. Of course, by this point, we're starting to think about the spread of discovery, European discovery to different worlds. We can see just the inkling of the United States and Canada here, North America, Mexico, down to South America, and then this very empty space over here. We're oftentimes very familiar with these sort of maps of the age of discovery. Obviously, there are parts like Antarctica and Australia do not appear on this map, but here the world map is showing not just a certain small region where we're, for instance, where we're trading, but these areas where these boats are trying to go, okay? So expanding the idea of at least these explorers and these map makers' consciousness and then the general public's consciousness in Europe as part of the European voyages of discovery, and then of course leading to the beginning of colonialism. So this is about expanding the map. Now, what about projections onto the world? How is it that once you know more or less, how one piece of land relates to another, you have longitude and latitude, how is it that you can project everything in a way that keeps things steady? So for instance, how is it that we can make sure that the lines between two places are steady in taking into the relationship of all of these land masses? Well, this is something that Gerardus Mercator, who was from Flanders, so present-day Belgium or northern France, he's most renowned for creating this world map, which proposed a new projection that represented the sailing courses and shows the constant bearing, so that in straight lines. Okay, so these are kinds of representations that are still employed today in nautical charts. And so Mercator was a big innovator in creating globes, in creating maps, and perfecting the representation of space as related to these relationships between the continents. So basically, with Mercator, we're in a fairly contemporary situation in terms of the actual globe. One of the other things that we want to keep in mind, though, is that not long after, pretty much at the same time as he was working, there are a bunch of political changes taking place that had something to do with the map. Okay, so increasingly, we're going to be seeing borders around discrete nation states developing, okay? And a system of coexisting sovereign states will, little by little, replace the old system of empires or, less well-bordered states and states that were not necessarily associated with particular languages or cultures or societies in the way that they are in the modern world. This is a map of coexisting sovereign states. Okay, so we see this, we're very familiar with this. Each country has its own color. We see clearly defined borders, but really this is the effect of a European Westphalian peace treaty in 1648. The Europeans had been in various wars for at least 30 years, and this was a really bloody time in European history where millions of people were killed. And so in 1648, leaders of the cities of Osnabrück and Münster in Germany got together and they signed something called the Westphalian Sovereignty, the peace treaty of 1648, which led to this idea that there should be a system of coexisting sovereign states where the state is sovereign over its own territory and its own people. And this is the kind of map then that illustrates the modern imagination of the nation-state system. So this is really important to take into account when we think about how we think of what a map is today. Of course, we don't only have political maps, but these kinds of imaginations of the state as that block of color and the leaders of that state as having sovereignty over that place, this is what is behind a lot of what we think of when we talk about modernity, and then, of course, globalization. By 1914, strangely, although we have a system of sovereign states, that other map, I remember the maps of discovery, we have Ribeiro, and then we have Mercator. By this time in 1914, on the eve of the First World War, we see how certain countries have become dominant as colonizing powers. This map uses the flags of the different countries to show who's in charge in different places. Okay, so there's sort of a contradiction between this idea that each state should have its own sovereign territory, people, culture, society, that these should all be linked on that, for the map we just saw. So from here, okay, it's all nice and clean. And here, where are those borders? How are we going to create that kind of map? Obviously, it's not given by nature. It's something that humans had to create. So by 1945, at the end of World War II, we see, again, that even though, say, Spain is this little bit here, it's connected to what was then the Western Sahara. The United States with the Philippines, we have India, different connections here that are not necessarily in line with the sort of Westphalian ideology of the sovereign nation state. Okay, so maps can help us to visualize this. Of course, at the same times in the 20th century and until 1989, you had the USSR. These different areas were all a part of the USSR, and then little by little, these countries became independent. So it's not like the nation state is something eternal. It's always evolving with political conditions. Today, the way that the colonial maps divided the world continues to have a lot of influence in what we might call post-empire organizations. So some of these are due to being contiguous and sharing language and trade. such as the Organization of Ibero-American States. Some of these have to do with language as a result of, say, colonialism. So for instance, there's France. These are all the Francophone countries so where they speak French to some degree. And then you have the Commonwealth, of course, from the British. So you can see those in red. So by using these different maps, we can represent different realities that aren't just about the political map, obviously. How is the map in general presented? Well, this is Peter's 1973 map, which is very stimulating and controversial because it plays with the idea of how we represent the world. It was first published in the English-speaking world in 1983. And when you notice this, one of the things you'll see, if we were together, I would ask you, like, what's different? Well, obviously, Africa is much bigger than on the usual maps that we look at. North America looks much smaller. And so because the Earth is round, any world map that we want to use to represent it on a flat surface can have a different kind of projection. So whether